Right. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everybody. Well, I think I need to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, as this webinar is like all over the place. So wherever you are, just take the greeting as per I said it. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. On behalf of Knowledge Oman, I'd like to welcome you all to our fourth webinar. And we're so excited to host both Roy and Roger in this fourth webinar. I'd like to start by saying my name is Balqis Al-Ahsani and I'm the president of Knowledge Oman. I'd like to give few shade of light on Knowledge Oman and like glimpse for those who doesn't know much about Knowledge Oman. Knowledge Oman is a multi-award winning knowledge sharing platform in the Sultanate of Oman. It was first founded in 2008 by Tariq Hilal al-Barwani. Now, the main purpose of Knowledge Oman was to support the Majesty, the late Majesty Sultan Qaboos' vision in turning Oman into a knowledge-based society. So Tariq al-Barwani thought of idea to support that idea, and he came up with the idea of Knowledge Oman. Now, we started to do all of the activities for the past 12 years and more, and the main objective was to bridge the gap between the academia and industry by getting experts from different fields, just like yourself, and share your knowledge to the society so people can learn and they can take and pick whatever suits them. So be it a student, a college university graduate, or an entrepreneur, those sessions are really of high importance. We in Knowledge Oman partner internationally and locally with many partners just to make the strength of our platform goes higher and higher. And we also support the vision of our current Sultan Haytham bin Tariq Al Said, and Oman Vision 2040 by equipping the Omani nation with the right skill, with the right knowledge to meet the Oman Vision 2040. Now, in today's session, everyone, I'd like to welcome Roy Shepherd, who is former BBC News anchor, specialist conference moderator, interviewer, author of many books on personal business and personal communication. I mean, Roy, how do you do all of that in one go? That's a lot of, mashallah, a nice CV of yours.
It's just getting up very early in the morning and getting on with it. 1,500 words a day.
So without further ado, I'll ask you, Roy, to go ahead and take the lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Salam alaikum, everyone. I've worked many times in the Middle East with the London Speaker Bureau in Oman. The head office is in Muscat, but it's my first visit to Oman. Sadly, I'm in the UK, though, for this Knowledge Oman webinar. But my guest is in Washington, D.C., and I'll introduce you to Roger in a moment. We have about 400 people who've chosen to attend today's webinar. So you're all very committed people and from all over the world, not just in Oman. And the whole purpose of today is to help stimulate your thinking really about the subject of communication, influence, impact, and effective marketing. And our guest today is a true expert on that because Roger Fisk was one of Barack Obama's political strategists, and he recruited and led a large team, many of whom were highly enthusiastic volunteers, which is an important part of this. Roger is actually acknowledged as being one of the key strategists to put Barack Obama into the White House for 2 terms. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what has American politics got to do with your business or your career, perhaps? Well, I'm very confident by the end of this webinar, you will understand the winning principles that Roger's going to be talking about, how you can then apply it to your career and to your business. And hopefully it will help you to become part of Oman's future success as a knowledge-based society. Now, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. A lot of comments have been coming up in the chat area already. So please submit your questions when you're listening to Roger and when I'm going to be chatting to him in a moment. Please try not to include the word Trump in your questions, though, if that's okay. Welcome, Roger.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
Another day gone. Right, I'm going to hand over to you now, and you're going to give us some thoughts for the next 5 minutes or so, and then I'll come back and we'll have a bit of a focused chat, I hope. So over to you.
Well, Roy, thank you so much. And thank you to the London Speaker Bureau and Knowledge Oman. Salam alaikum to everyone who's tuning in. Thank you so much for choosing to spend some time with us. I arrive at a very interesting kind of point, and it was not necessarily with intention, but having worked 3 presidential campaigns, I have a pretty good sense of how to get millions of people involved in big ideas that matter. And that's kind of what we want to speak about here. When Roy says, what does this have to do with anyone's business in Oman or anywhere else? The fact of the matter is that, technology and information are changing almost daily, certainly more rapidly than quarterly or monthly or anything. And what I hope to share with everyone is the culture that we created in the 2 Obama campaigns and how it even is existing now to this day, that was very, very closely tuned into technological changes, sociological changes, political changes, et cetera, and built a culture that was really focused on the individual, and then used online tools and things like that around that. So when you think of, what do lessons from my communications work have to do with the work that you do? All of us ultimately are competing for people's attention. And I like to call that kind of the attention economy. If you can't get someone's attention, or what's in the online world called, eyeballs and clicks, then you can't persuade them, you can't get them involved in a cause, or you can't get them to attend an event or purchase a product. If you can't get their attention, then nothing else really matters. So one of the first things that I always focus on is like, how do we get people to decide to spend 30 or 45 or even 60 seconds absorbing some content? And how do we design that content in a way that has a very specific outcome in mind in terms of what we want that individual to do? To go back to the very kind of beginning of the Obama trajectory, since I joined in January of 2007, then Senator Obama laid out a couple organizational priorities or values that really set us apart. And one of the first things he said was that we are not in charge of this. We are not the headquarters. The entire campaign and everything we do and all the tools that we build are going to be about the individual and empowering the individual to go out and organize people in their lives, people that they live with, that they work with, and give them the tools to go out and personalize their involvement in the campaign. The second thing that we also did was to just start with a blank piece of paper and say, if you have a target demographic, and let's say for the sake of argument, your target demographic is, young married couples between the ages of 25 and 35 that are about to buy their first home and start a family, which, as many of you may know in marketing terms, is an extremely coveted demographic. There's some mile markers in people's lives that all of the marketers are really focused on. When you go to college, when you get married, buying your home, preparing for retirement, those are all very, high value targets for marketers. So if we want to look at our 25 to 35-year-old young couple that's about to buy their first home and start a family, what we need to do is not sit in a vacuum as a bunch of smart people in a conference room and decide what this couple cares about and how they're living their lives. I'm a huge fan of crowdsourcing, but going out and finding where that target demographic is living their online lives, where are they getting their news, where are they doing their purchasing, things like that. And then once you start to kind of back up from that set of knowledge, and then you arrive at the product that you actually want to reach out to them with, the way forward is actually quite clear, because you've started with them as individuals, and you know when they get up in the morning, where are they getting their news and how are they conducting their online lives. So a lot of that came from Senator Obama's intense focus on the individual. To be very specific, to just give you one example, we, for the first time ever, invited people into our website and invited people to generate content in our website, which created much more of a 21st century model of a back and forth between individuals in the campaign, rather than the 20th century model of the campaign just talking at people saying, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is what we're going to do. We designed our online presence to be much more of a conversation, so that we hit people with not just statements, but also questions. And basically the way it would work, and Roy, I'll finish this here and hand it over to you in a quick second, is you could go on to our website and actually create a portal and create a dashboard that if you thought the campaign should be doing more on issues related to teachers, you could go and actually help us generate that activity and generate that content, or nurses, or small business owners, or anything else. And that was all part of that organizational belief of focusing our energy on empowering the individual, not looking at the headquarters as some all-knowing, all-powerful hub of decision-making, but much more crowdsourcing things and much more going out to people. And that resulted in a culture that was able to, what I call, inhale and exhale with millions of people much better. And we'll touch on some more examples as we go along. But a lot of it was laid out by the senator himself. And then we navigated in the course of this, the migration from the desktop to mobile, all those different things that we'll get into in the next 30 or 40 minutes. But it's been very, very interesting. And it's left me with kind of an odd set of skills. But I do have a good sense of how to get millions of people involved in big ideas that matter.
Can I ask you to clarify something, a word that you used twice just now and probably use it all the time, for the benefit of people who don't fully understand it? Can you explain crowdsourcing?
Sure. First off, there's tools like SurveyMonkey and things like that, where you can basically say, there's a saying in community organizing groups here in the United States, that is, if it involves us, it has to involve us, which means if you're going in and you're building some kind of a development in a part of a city, you have to, the people that live in that part of the city have to be part of it. Now, to put this in a political or a marketing context, anyone who is going to go out and mount a marketing campaign, say, let's stick with our young couple between the ages of 25 and 35, should go out and use some of these very inexpensive online tools, putting together maybe informal focus groups. You can go out and do some simple A/B testing on Facebook, a whole bunch of different ways you can do this, but go out to that demographic and ask them what that marketing campaign should look like. Ask them what's important to them. So then when you actually roll out a campaign that you've involved your target demographic in the creation of, then it will have much greater resonance. Your click rates will go up. The amount of time that people spend on your page will go up. When you get 100 RSVPs to an event, your flake rate will be much less, in the sense of 80 or 90 people will show up rather than dropping down to 50 or 60. All of those things boost engagement. And once you have people engaged, to get back to my original point, then you have their attention, and then you can start to persuade. You can get them to try to, consider purchasing a product, engaging a service, traveling somewhere, etc. But if you can't get their attention at the beginning, then nothing else really matters. And that's why crowdsourcing is so important.
I mean, it's so funny. I mean, I've sat in boardrooms when I've been involved in conferences, and, I've seen a group of middle-aged white men talking about how they're going to engage with women, and nobody thought of asking women to have a say about anything.
Yeah. And then what you're witnessing right there, and I realize most of our viewers are in Oman, where it doesn't really get cold, but here in the States, I would compare that to leaving your window open in the winter, right? You're just allowing countless units of energy and resources and time and everything else to just go out the window. Because if you're not consulting and reaching out to the target demographic and involving them in the contours of how you're going to engage them, then you're wasting time, you're wasting money, and you're not going to hit your numbers.
Okay, we're talking here about operational stuff, but you were a strategist, and a lot of people don't get the strategy right in the first place. So, of course, everything else then is off kilter. It doesn't really work. What mistakes have you seen organizations, whether they're political or corporate, what mistakes do they make when it comes to strategy that should really be addressed early on? Sure.
I mean, one of the biggest mistakes that I see, I'll answer in a political context and then a market context. In a political context, one of the biggest mistakes I see is when an entire campaign culture is built around an individual who still doesn't necessarily know what it is that they want to go out and present as their vision. I think you could put Governor Romney, now Senator Romney, that we ran against in 2012 into that bucket. And frankly, I think you could put Secretary Clinton from 2016 roughly into that bucket, which is if that individual doesn't have a crystal clear sense of exactly where they want to go and how they want to get there and what they want to do once they get there, then it makes it very difficult to convince other people to buy into that, because if the individual themselves doesn't know, then you're basically trying to sell something that is still somewhat vague. In a marketing context, the biggest mistakes that I see, I think some of the most fraudulent documents around are annual reports, right? Like I read these annual reports and they're these gauzy, feel-good language things. And I think if you're, a venture capital firm and you're willing to step over your grandmother to maximize shareholder value, then you're very well served by saying exactly that. The mistake that I see in a lot of market contexts is that organizations will present themselves like you could pick up the annual report from that venture capital firm and it'll say, we regard ourselves as stewards of each individual's capacities to lift lives in their community or whatever, when lo and behold, they're a venture capital firm that's willing to step over their grandmother. So when a news story comes or when something happens in that quarter or in their numbers and they end up being a recipient of a lot more scrutiny, if they've been honest all along about exactly who they are, and then the financial press puts them under a microscope, and lo and behold, they're a venture capital firm that's willing to step over their grandmother to maximize shareholder value, then there's consistency. Then there's, at least people aren't saying like, well, they said they were A and then they ended up being Z. So for a lot of these organizations, putting a public face onto something that is at odds with who they really are is just, again, wasting a lot of time and resources. And ultimately, as your consumers become more educated, they're going to figure that out for themselves and they'll leave you behind.
I mean, I was in a boardroom once and there were 6 guys in the boardroom, and I asked them to all write down without conferring what the company strategy was. And we had 5 different answers, and they were the leaders of the business. So coming back to the point of strategy, is being clear and making sure everybody who's a decision maker is clear on it so that they can communicate that more effectively to their people. Yeah. Right.
I mean, imagine then if you have 5 of those 6 people that wrote down something different, then they're going off to their teams are going off and speaking to their regional representatives. And what you end up with is one of the things that I really try to inoculate organizations and causes and candidates against, which is what I call scattered good intentions. You just end up with kind of just these vague messages that are different people's versions of what they think they should be saying. Whereas when you look at the Obama culture, if you read an article about Senator Obama in 2007 and you saw a clip of a speech of him in 2011, and then you got an email from him in 2016, there would actually be narrative cohesion there. There would actually be the same set of strategic priorities and values and calls to action and things like that. And that can only come when a culture is built around a leader or a product who knows what they want to do, knows what their value proposition is. And that then a culture and a campaign and a whole outreach initiative around it echoes those core values, because that's how you build a culture that can scale, that can go from 15, 20 people on up through 5,000 employees and $1 billion as a corporation like we were as a campaign. Or you go the other route and you leave that conference room with those 5 people who had 5 different understandings, and you go out and then you wonder after 3 or 4 quarters why you haven't moved the needle and you haven't penetrated and gotten any responses from your target demographic.
What I found particularly interesting about what you all successfully did, you didn't only go out and get people who were ultimately going to vote, but you got people to become very involved. So you alluded to it earlier on, you gave them the tools then to not only be supporters, but to become enthusiastic activists to recruit more people. And I find that the similarities between political campaigning in the way that you did using social media and how businesses can operate in the same way is huge, has a huge potential. But businesses don't tend to think like that. They think that something personal is sort of less professional. It has to be more slick and more polished. Do you have a view on that? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe we live in an age now where any product or service that's going to be around for a while has to look at each potential consumer or current consumer much more as a relationship, much more as a conversation, rather than a standalone persuasion exercise. You know, the days of just, all right, I'm going to focus on Roy, and I need Roy to sign up for my online service. And then as soon as he signs up, I'm going to move on to the next consumer. That's not how things work anymore. And the really smart organizations try to factor in the larger appetites of their consumers into how they're offering services. Just for example, once we navigated the migration from the desktop to the mobile phone, in the second campaign, what we found is that when you reach out to young voters, what we could loosely call millennials right now, they were much more interested in helping a cause that also presented them options for a broader impact. And by that, I mean, so we would not only just send them information, we would not only give them an opportunity to donate, but we would also say, help out communities impacted by the wildfires, or help out, you know, the Red Cross or the United Way or something else, where we weren't just looking at them as like someone that we were trying to have a one-off transaction with. We looked at them as a full kind of human being. And when we reached out to engage them and persuade them, it wasn't just about getting them information about us, but it was also about providing them ways to have a broader positive impact on the world. The second thing, and I'll leave this here after, is we really looked upon taking that example of giving each individual the tools to go out and persuade. Once we got into the second campaign, one of the things we did was we developed a Facebook app that people could download, and we could run analytics on their Facebook friends. And then we could see where they had friends, again, based on their permission, in key areas of the country that we really needed to activate. So long story short, we would go to you, Roy, and say, you, Roy, you've downloaded this Facebook app. We've run analytics, and you have 17 friends in this area that we need a lot of help in. Here's a couple news articles about President Obama's work in the economy, or here's a couple news articles about President Obama's work saving General Motors. Could you forward those to your friends? And the difference is then your 17 friends that receive that, it's not another top-down slick email from some headquarters somewhere, you know, back on that conference room idea. It's from Roy. It's from you. It's from someone that they know. It's a much different way. It takes more time and resources, but it's a much different way of looking at people and looking at how you truly engage them and motivate them. So those are just a couple examples, but it worked beautifully. And to then connect it to my earlier answer, it all got back to those core organizational values that I discussed right at the beginning.
It's funny, while you were talking, I was thinking about how this would impact on the individual. And I see that we have a question from Tanuja Sharma, which says, how about the common man or a person? You can see it on the screen there. Maybe you can read that too. I'm very aware that people can read a lot quicker than I can speak.
Yeah, if you'd like me to speak directly to it, you know, one of the first things is, and I developed this very early when I was just a little intern, is this phrase called the scrutiny threshold, which is people have a gut reaction to an email or a commercial or even a person, where they automatically decide, and usually the first 30 to 45 seconds, if this person is who they say they are. So for a lot of folks, you know, they might not agree with me, or they might not have been fans of Barack Obama or something like that. But essentially, they've already decided if I am who I say I am. And they've already decided if I'm being authentic and presenting my real self. So the first thing that I would keep in mind for the questioner is to be authentic. If you're a young, struggling entrepreneur and you're just getting your first, you know, office up and running, you know, don't rent a Mercedes-Benz and cut a commercial as if you're a master of the universe and that you are in charge of, you know, 100,000 employees or whatever. Just straight to the camera. Be very, very honest. I'm just starting out. Here's my idea. This is what I'm working on. This is how it's going to provide value to our consumers. And just be honest and direct. because once you A, get people's attention, but then B, that they think you're actually believable, that they think you're being honest and sincere, and that they're getting the real person that you are, then you can move forward and start to have some communication and trust, and then ultimately a business transaction. But if you come at it dishonest, if you try to present yourself as something that you are not, like those companies that I said with their flowery language in their annual reports or whatever, you're just setting up a breach, you're setting up a rupture. And sooner or later, what you really are is going to come up against the public persona that you're trying to shop. And A, it won't work. And B, you will have wasted a lot of time and resources. And we can talk more about that, but that's the first rule, I think.
Okay. In addition to what you've just said, there's a question here from Aniketh Narayanan. I hope I've said that right. What is the one quality of former President Barack Obama that you admired, let's say admire still in the present tense? But I could imagine that what you've just been talking about would apply to him. But what else?
Well, the most interesting thing about him is, you know, he's very much like what you see. I mean, he's a serious person. He's able to kind of laugh and things like that. But what you see is really what's there. There's not a lot of artifice. He cares deeply about this country. He cares deeply about the world. He's obviously very cerebral. He likes to think before he speaks, all of those things. And I think, you know, what I most admired about him was early on, you know, he said to us, we're going to go out there, and this echoes and builds on the point that I just made. We're going to go out there. I'm going to present myself as honestly and as transparently as I possibly can. We're going to say exactly what our values are and what our agenda is and where we hope to take the country. And if people embrace it, then we move forward. And if people reject it, then we fold up and we're done. And so what that allowed us to do, when I talked about building that culture around it, was to then echo those same values and go out and be exactly who he is and amplify that and hire people around him that could go out and do the same thing. And then fortunately it caught on. It was the right combination of kind of the man and the movement and kind of rapidly changing technology and things like that. But he was never going to put himself in a situation where he comes out of the box marketing change, and then all of a sudden something happens in the news cycle and people are more interested in experience. So then he says, oh, well, let's throw aside change and let's go with experience. And then 2 quarters later, it's back to change. And then it's just zigging and zagging and ricocheting all over the place. Slow, steady, like a fixed compass, knowing who you are and where you want to go. And that's ultimately why we won. Okay.
Mohit Bhatia asked a very simple question. Who decides these values, you know, on the team? Is it just, you know, the boss?
Well, it's like anything else, right? I mean, there's be it a Bill Gates or a Zuckerberg or anyone else. There's the initial idea. There's the kind of very center kind of kernel, which is Senator Obama. And then in the course of, you know, his U.S. Senate campaign, he picked up some people. That's where some of my good friends from Senator Kerry's world got involved. But then if you're patient and you're trying to look for people that can really fit into your culture and be sincere ambassadors of that culture, and, you know, the onus, the burden, the importance of a really good HR team has to be referenced here right now. Because how you go out and how you comb through applicants and how you find people, how you scale that culture is extremely important. So it's not just the individual, but it does come down to the individual initially surrounding himself with a handful of people that are pure reflections of the individual, the leader's kind of vision, values, agenda, and then, you know, concentrically building out from there, just like any other effort scales up from a startup with 5 or 10 people on through their IPO with 3,000 employees.
Okay, can I just make a comment? We've been having a lot of comments from somebody called James Fry. James, you just said that you had a question. It wasn't a question. So can you resubmit it as a question? All right, so we can take that off. We'll come back to James in a moment. I mean, you're talking about, you know, good, wholesome values, the sort of West Wing sort of approach to politics and life. I've worked in the technology field for many, many years, and technology companies for years have operated on something called FUD, FUD, which stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's very effective too, not only in business, but also, I have to say, in politics too. Do you have a view on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's first off, when I talk about these things, I'm talking about how they've worked for us and motivated people loosely on our side of the aisle, right? And I'll share this analytically, but as you can see with the current occupant of the White House, that you can flip this coin, right? And instead of trying to build an organization that's based on empowering individuals and giving them the tools to organize people in their lives, you can have a campaign that's essentially based on grievance and fear and complaint. To put that in a policy context, it's one thing to say, on our side of the aisle, we would say we want to make community college more affordable so that mid-career adults can go off and get new skills. Seems decent, right? The flip side of that is someone came to your town and took your job, right? It appeals to very, very different parts of the brain. One is saying, like, this is going to require time and energy from you, but we can fix it, and here's how you can do it. The other is, let's focus on who you're mad at. Let's focus on your grievance, and then just dwell on that and stoke it, right? And throw more gasoline on it. So unfortunately, yeah, and there's no shortage of examples of ways to just play off grievance and fear. You can look anywhere in the world over the last 100 years and see examples of how that's gone.
Well, you could the last 100 days.
Yeah, but at least for our side in America, if it's got to be upbeat and it's got to be optimistic, because the mandate that we have from the founders of this country is in order to form a more perfect union, right? It's not in order to inherit or maintain or anything else. It's in order to form, which is why at least people on our side of the aisle are focused on building and moving forward and not just regretting and being upset about what happened yesterday or 10 years ago or 50 years ago.
Okay, there's some great questions coming in. Kavitha Jacob, what was the biggest challenge that you faced relating to the campaigns, and how did you manage them?
We haven't even touched on traditional media, and I'd like to maybe use that question as an example. It's and this also gets to organizational kind of cultural values. A lot of organizations and marketers right now are constantly lunging at the newest app or the newest kind of widget or the thing that they think is going to give them some cutting edge advantage over their competition. And I think one of the things that we did well was to remember that the traditional media and the traditional tools of media like radio and television and newspapers are best used when they are enhanced and are part of a social media strategy, just as social media is best used when it's force multiplied with traditional media as well. So I think one of the things that we were able to really do is create that culture that we've touched on a couple times, and we've talked about our 25 to 35-year-old young couple, but that culture was equally adept at reaching a rural individual person who was 75 years old, for example, or any number of other kind of demographics. So if you were reaching out to a young person in an urban environment, you would use tools that were different than how you would reach out to an older person in a rural environment. But we were able to do all of that still with that narrative cohesion. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges for marketers is being able to reach out to a number of different demographics, reach out in kind of culturally appropriate ways and touch them where they're getting their information, but still using both old and new tools and not depending on either. Because if you just depend on one, then you're missing out on a full spectrum engagement campaign. And that's how marketers need to do it nowadays to win.
Sanitha Francis said the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal proved how social media can demolish our democracies. Do you have a take on that? I'm sure you do.
Well, yeah, it's very, very interesting, and I appreciate the question. We could do a whole program just on that. Ultimately, things are just things, right? So you can pick up a hammer and build a house, or you can pick up a hammer and bash through a window and break into a house, right? It's everything is in the intent of the user. And it almost gets back to my answer of a couple minutes ago. If you want to go out and build a positive, uplifting campaign that engages millions of people in your product or your service, you can do that. And if you want to go out and use social media to divide people and to get regions of the country or constituencies to resent each other and to throw gasoline onto disagreements or cultural grievances, then you can do that as well. So I don't know that we can necessarily look at a social media tool and say it is inherently good or it's inherently bad. It comes down to the intent and the values of the person or the organization that picks that up and picks up that tool and uses it to reach out to 100 people or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people. So, like I said, you can pick it up and you can build a house, or you can pick it up and you can break a window.
Kavin Kishan says, has the time come for social media to replace all traditional media on the strategic front?
The answer to that is no. I mean, I think it's very interesting. Like in the United States right now, the television experience is becoming more like the online experience, and the online experience is becoming more like the television experience. So they're kind of, meeting in the middle and becoming kind of a blend of one another. But when you get into, and we haven't even touched on things like data and analytics, although we're kind of circling around them without talking about them directly, some of the things that we've done and that marketers have now picked up is when you have your social media campaign, you know what your target demographic is, where they're getting their information and living their online lives. Then it's a question of, you can be really creative in how you reach out to them. We got down to the point, and I know of certain businesses that are doing this to this point, to this day, where we actually knew in key regions of specific zip codes across the country, all the way down to specific neighborhoods, that there were bus lines, public bus lines, for example, that we knew some of our target voters traveled on. So we got all the way down to renting those ads that are up above you as you're standing on the bus or on the subway, because we had broken down our data and analytics to know exactly where people were. So that's traditional media. Another example would be, we found that, for example, in the Midwest, there's a lot of people that still work second shift. And for those that don't know what that means, a lot of us work 9 to 5 or something like that. But if you work in a factory and the factory is operating, 20 hours a day, there's a lot of people that go into work at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and they come home at 1 or 2 in the morning. And we knew that. And we found that on certain cable systems around the country, we could buy ad space on certain shows at 1 or 2 in the morning for literally pennies. And we knew that we could get precise penetration into specific demographics by those local cable system ad buys, whereas our opponents were spending hundreds of millions of dollars in broad national ad buys, which got back to that kind of scattered good intentions dynamic that I mentioned earlier. But we were much more of a needle. They were acting like a shotgun and we were like a needle. We knew exactly where our target demographic was and we could reach them for pennies with traditional media.
There's loads of questions coming in now, and I'm just aware I'd love to get through them. Some great questions. Saju Nath, could you please tell us what drastic changes are you expecting in the communication media in the next 10 years, and how is it going to affect the lives of people? I'm assuming that's 10. Yeah, it is 10 years.
I think, one of the most troubling things, and it gets to data and analytics, is the focus on dynamic content right now online is so intense that we are not far from, and in many ways we already live in the world where you, Roy, could be standing on one corner of an intersection. I could be standing on another corner, and maybe Saju could be standing on a different corner. We could all witness a traffic accident, and then we could all go home. And when we start to click online, we could all start to see 3 very different news accounts of that accident, right? So my point in that is that the idea of any single set of common knowledge is being fractured when we get into such an intense focus on dynamic content that is specific to you. So you and I could be sitting next to each other with laptops out. we could be going through the same news site, but we're already seeing different ad content. And the day is not far where we're going to start seeing different news content about the same subject. Right now, you could see I could pull up and I could get an article about a storm, and you could get an article about the traffic accident. But the day's not far where all three of us could sit next to each other, all of us be on our laptops. We all see articles about the traffic accident, and all three tell different stories.
Well, that ties in very well with Aniketh Narayan's next question. Thank you very much for that. How is artificial intelligence and machine learning helping in this process? Well, I mean, the question says helping, but it might not actually be a help for the receiver of the message, although it's being far more targeted, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the two questions are very closely related. AI is ultimately in the business of anticipation, right? So at some point, you start to cross the Rubicon from AI anticipating what that individual is going to do to then AI kind of guiding what that individual is going to do. And so to the individual in the online experience, it can feel like the individual is making decisions, but AI is actually, providing a framework so that individual is getting walked down a road, and they don't even know they're getting walked down that road because it all still feels like they're clicking and making their decisions. But AI is actually already anticipated 7 and 8 and 10 moves down the road. So that kind of thing is very troubling, and it gets to the fracturing that I mentioned a couple minutes ago too.
Okay, that's about predicting our future behavior. There's a question here, which I think is a great question. Dr. Baby Sam Samuel, great name that. How can marketeers transform the cultural need for real world connections and word of mouth marketing digitally with the same set of principles and value system? Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Doctor. It's we're all kind of navigating that right now, right? By working at home, trying to, get to know new colleagues that have maybe joined since the virus hit, and how do you establish that kind of rapport and build trust with someone that you only know in a digital context? So much of what we lose when we don't have an actual workplace is similar to what kids lose when they don't go to the classroom. The social kind of skills that develop, the ability to read body language and to see how people process information and make decisions and things like that. So I don't know that there's necessarily an answer to that, but I do know that we're in the process of trying to answer that, because for most of the world, in one form or another, that's the world that we're living in now. We're barely interacting in person, certainly, very rarely in a professional context. So all of us are having to kind of engage in this almost purely digital world while still trying to pick up on kind of the broader human signals that we all send, because that's ultimately how a lot of us communicate. If you're sitting across the table from someone in a meeting and they're saying all the right things, but they're slouched back in their chair and they're looking at their phone, you don't believe them. You're not tuned into them. Whereas someone else who might know a little less, but they're leaning forward and they're looking at you and they're staring you straight in the eye and you have their attention, you're going to respond to them much more favorably. So the expertise of the disinterested person is going to lose to the person who's actually connected with you and is respecting your time and realizing that they should listen to you. And those are the things that we're going to have to work out, kind of in this new arena. I don't necessarily have an answer to it yet, but I know we're in the middle of trying to answer that.
Golden Hornet Oman. Oman as a market, social media is still not very strong. How can we use social media in a small market such as Oman to market a product or services, specifically event management during COVID? Event management during COVID. Now, there's a topic for a couple of weeks discussion.
Yeah. I mean, I was the director of special events for the Obama campaign, so I guess I wouldn't even have a job this cycle. One of the most important things when people, let me just read this again. It's not very strong. How can we use social media to market product or service, especially I think I've kind of touched on this a little bit, but if you're just, the good news is if you're just starting out, then you have an opportunity to try to kind of establish a very authentic and honest voice as social media grows in Oman. Saying exactly who you are, saying what it is that you're selling or presenting, or what the product or the cause or the candidate or anything like that, being believable and being authentic and being sincere, those are the things that work in person-to-person contact. And those are the things that I think will prevail in online contact as well. Everything has to be an extension of that core kind of authenticity. And so even if people feel like they're not presentable or something like that, if they can still, if you've gotten to the point where you're an entrepreneur and you have a product or some kind of service that you're providing, you have to know in your head why that product or service has evolved, where the idea came from, what it can do in people's lives. And maybe you have to practice it a little bit or something like that, but you should be able to speak for 30, 60, 90 seconds about that product or service and why you started it and how you think it can help people. And then you need to capture that and then start to use snippets of that online. And those are your first steps on having a authentic and believable social media presence, which will get you a marketing edge.
I mean, I have to say, I mean, I was in Saudi just before the lockdown, and I was involved in a conference, and they were using Twitter quite a lot. And I was amazed that over 2 days, they'd be getting nearly 500,000 hits on various Twitter things. So when you have social media that's particularly relevant, it's going to grow. So going back to that question, isn't it really about embracing the social media and making it more relevant than it is at the moment, so that people don't want to ignore it because it is useful stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And then to talk about this in terms of like human resources and things like that, you know, it used to be, and by that I only mean 6 or 8 years ago, that an organization of say 50 people would have, you know, one social media staffer, right? And they just think, oh, if you just, post our logo and our annual report or whatever, that's what you do. Those days are over. And so the other thing that I think people need to understand is between your data and your analytics and your social media and things like that, that really needs to be reflected as a priority in your human resources, in your budget and things like that. If you think by just having one kid in the small office at the back of everything, who's, you know, quote unquote, doing your social media is going to cut it, especially if you're competing in a public facing way, you know, to get your product or service out there. That's not how you're going to succeed. It has to be something that's a living and breathing priority for you in terms of your human resources and your budgets and things like that. The days of doing it with one kid who just hits send and things like that is over. And my last point on that too is, because what you're ultimately looking for with your social media is to start conversations and to create places where people can go for information. So it's not just a sending exercise anymore. You actually need enough people there that when people start to reply and come to you with questions about your product or service, that you're there and you're available and you're responsive. Because the last thing you want to do is blast a bunch of information out there, get people's attention for 30 seconds. Then they start to lean towards you. They start to express some interest. And then when they come back to you with a reply or a question, there's silence.
I mean, I'm very aware of the time. You said something there about, you know, having a kid to press submit and send or whatever. That really is about having people working in social media who just do as they're told by people that don't really understand it. But there's a question here from Rofin K. John. He says, as a young entrepreneur, how do I reach clients during this time of the pandemic who are not effectively proficient in the digital world? So this is a practical question based on hopefully a rare occurrence in humanity, but having to deal with the real world. Got any views on that?
Sure. I think the larger function of kind of knowledge transfer is very important for people to remember, which is it's above and beyond your product or your service. I used the example, I think, when we were chatting the other day, Roy, that, you know, I get information from the bank that holds my mortgage about the broader kind of global financial picture, right? So they're not just providing me my mortgage. They're actually sending me relatively, you know, well thought out analysis of where the global economy is going. So they position themselves as a source of knowledge. And my point with that is then, if the questioner has a target demographic who's not currently online, then why don't you go out and find the 2 or 3, 3 to 5 minute workshops on YouTube or anywhere else that are specifically designed to help senior citizens access Facebook, or for senior citizens or whatever your demographic is, to conduct a Zoom meeting. There's, as anyone knows, there's instructional videos about virtually anything you can possibly imagine out there on the web. So if you acknowledge that you have a target demographic and you acknowledge that they need to learn something in order to start bringing them down the road towards your product or service, then why don't we make that education curve and that process part of your marketing? So you can actually create the knowledge that allows them to start to embrace your product. Because if you're bumping up against a wall and you have a target demographic and there's a wall there so that they, in the sense that they can't access your or have enough information to understand the value that you're providing, then it stands to reason that part of your marketing strategy can be giving them the skills, back on our focus on the individual, to get over those hurdles, access more information, and along the way you've positioned yourself as a trusted source of knowledge for them, and then you can turn them into a consumer.
Okay. AVP senior rather, the very purpose of mass communication is to move the masses towards a vision. Is world leadership guiding the globe ethically, or is it more like a compliance initiative?
I don't understand the second part. I do understand the first. I mean, it gets to my answer of about, sorry, go ahead, Roy.
Do we have ethical leadership, or do we have just leadership that's doing what they think they should be doing? That's my take on it.
Yeah, and I think we touched on it a little bit, but like I said, these are all just things, right? So you can bully someone into considering suicide on Facebook, or you can organize a local canned food drive for hungry families, right? These are all just tools. And so in that sense, what you're asking is, can social media still be used by the darker side of humanity? And obviously the answer is yes. My fundamental bearings are optimistic, and I like to focus on what the positive things that people can do. And social media, is a good tool for that. But if you're, none of us have to think that far, that long, to think of organizations or individuals around the world that are, for example, using social media to recruit or give people the instructions about how to harm people, or any number of other things. So in that sense, it's content free. And like I said, it's a hammer, right? You can pick it up and you can build a house, or you can break a window.
Okay, Sweet and Spicy says, being an educator, how do you strengthen the relationship with students in this pandemic, where we're going to be beginning the new academic year virtually and not face to face? Any tips, any advice?
That's very tough, and similar to the question a couple minutes ago, where I think we're in the process of kind of answering this. Some of the states in the here in America are going with kind of a hybrid approach. And, I think we all knew starting a few months ago that this was going to be more dial than switch, right? It was going to be more kind of starting to modulate between the digital and online and the in-person. And I think, what could be considered a win, especially as we head into the first semester of the academic year in the United States, is some kind of very safe blended approach, which would be, half or more of the curriculum and things like that online. And then students maybe actually coming to a classroom environment 1 or 2 times a week rather than 5 times a week. And then also splitting up those students so that, Roy, you would go on Mondays and Thursdays, I would go on Tuesdays and Fridays. So you don't have a classroom of 30 people, but you have a classroom of 15 people. So then you can distance people and things like that. It's not going to be perfect. And then unfortunately, just like many other things, when societies don't tackle these big problems, these problems normally end up in the laps of 3 people, which is the nurse, the police officer, and the teacher. And in this case, the teacher is going to bear a lot of this burden because what they're going to have to do is take a little extra time, maybe do one-on-one Zooms with each student for even 15 or 20 minutes or something like that, to try to establish that kind of personal rapport so that then when they have a group, they have an understanding of what the, kind of strengths and weaknesses and unique situations are of each student. But, similar to like what I said a couple questions ago, there's not necessarily an answer for this, but the good news is that we're all involved right now in trying to figure out what a good answer could be.
Okay, well, everybody's doing the best they can is my mantra to life. There's a question here. We are running out of time. By Haida Kamis, how can you harness the power of social media for more of a business to business model rather than business to consumer or political?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of ways to do that. I mean, if you want to think of it in a regional context, you can do a lot of A/B testing and things like that, and create micro universes of potential customers.
What's a micro universe?
So you can basically say, if say you operate in the New England region of the United States, you can go out and say, I'm in the printing business and I want to find businesses that have high volumes of printing needs. You could go out and you could basically come up with 5 or 10 companies that are in the high printing business, or their needs are high in that regard. They put out catalogs, they put out et cetera. And then, through at least Facebook, you can go out and then say, here's the profile of my ideal business to business consumer, my ideal kind of customer. And then Facebook can go out and then find demographically reflective businesses that fit that same profile, either in a constituency, so small businesses, or you're going to go after the Fortune 500 or whatever, or in a geographic context, you can say within these 5 zip codes, or within these 3 states, or within this region. And, that's the beauty of how data and analytics work right now. If you want to say to one of these social media tools, I want to know of every redheaded, left-handed garlic farmer in, the state of Texas, you can go out and find them. So that same approach can apply to like a B2B context as well.
Okay, we are running out of time, and because of your background and because of what's going on in America, I personally have to bring this up. Steve Bannon was a political strategist for President Trump. He's now been arrested on a charge of wire fraud, which makes him, I think, the 6th former Trump advisor to be arrested or jailed. How many of President Obama's past advisors have ended up in prison? Okay, and how well do you sleep at night?
Perfectly.
So is that ultimately the differences of approach? What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of months in terms of what Joe Biden's strategic direction is going to be, when we've already seen that the Donald Trump team have been very effective at doing what it sees as the most important thing? And I'm aware that we haven't got very much time now.
Sure. I think it's going to reflect a lot of what we've touched on here. The Biden campaign is going to go out and try to present a positive vision that's policy based, that like, here are the steps that we need to go through to improve how we learn and how we age and how we educate our young, and any of these, very kind of basic challenges in life. And then the flip side of that coin will be the constant focus on grievance, fear, conspiracy, things like that. And there's a ready-made reservoir of support for both of those. Roughly, both candidates walk into the fall with about 65 million votes, and then the fight is really over about 10 million votes that exist in about 4 or 5 parts of the country: the I-4 corridor of Florida, the Philadelphia suburbs, and the suburbs around Columbus, Ohio, for example. And what's most interesting to me is the most powerful political force in America is a 40-year-old homeowning mother of 2. That's who decides American presidential campaigns. So that the competition is going to be for that 40-year-old homeowning mother of 2 in 4 or 5 areas across the country. And we'll see if they, respond to a positive, let's build a common future kind of message from the Biden campaign, or more of the fear-based, grievance-based campaigns from the current occupant of the White House.
We have got to bring this to a close now, Roger. Can I just say thank you to everyone who's been submitting questions? This is what happens all the time. Very slow start, and then all of a sudden there's a torrent of questions, and there's some brilliant questions have literally come in the last couple of moments. And one or two of them could take us through for the next few hours, actually.
You fill up the rest of the day, too.
So can I just say thank you to everybody who's been engaged. It's a Saturday. You're investing in your future. Hopefully that today has stimulated your thinking. Roger, obviously, can I thank you for your time and for your insight too? It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Roy, and it was your able hand that made it so. But thank you to the London Speaker Bureau, and thank you to Knowledge Oman. And if people have some questions that they want to filter through Knowledge Oman and get to me, I'm more than happy to continue to try to shed some light on these things, because it's really interesting and it's a lot of fun.
Okay, that's great. Roger, thank you very much. And using the principles of what you've said, if you found this webinar to be really, really useful, tell everybody you know about it to help spread the word. Roger, thank you. Thank you to everybody. Enjoy the rest of your time. Cheers.